Two teams that came into the season with high expectations and have not lived up to those, TCU and Texas Tech. They're squaring off on Thursday, both teams coming off a bye week. We'll talk about what it means for the Frogs and how to slow down this Texas Tech team. We'll do that next here on Locked On Horned Frogs.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right, Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. I'm your host, Steven Simcox. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also find us wherever it is you get your podcast, and it's audio variety, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all those different things. It's game week again, just coming off that bye week for TCU, and it's not really a short week. The team plays on Thursday night when they take on the Texas Tech Red Raiders in Lubbock, and this is an important football game, right? I mean, there's the obvious reason why it's important. You've got 4 wins. You got to get 2 more to get to bowl eligibility. And the bottom line is Texas Tech on the road and then Baylor at home are the 2 games where you feel best about winning. TCU is an underdog by the betting odds right now. I believe it opened as Tech is 2.5-point favorites there on FanDuel and Caesar Sportsbooks and others. And so basically a pick'em game. You know, college football sportsbooks or sportsbooks love, in college football, they love home teams. Generally, if there's any similarity or if it's close, they're going to give the edge to the home team. It's just a matter of how much that point spread is going to be. So TCU a slight underdog from a betting perspective in this football game, but you need to win this one in the game against Baylor, and those are your best chances to make a bowl game. You can still do it if you beat Texas or Oklahoma, but I just don't feel great about that at the moment. I know Oklahoma looks more vulnerable. They just lost Kansas. That defense seems to have come back down to earth in a big way after starting the season really well. And I think Dylan Gabriel and that offense struggle with consistency throwing the football. But I just don't feel like TCU is good enough up front on both sides of the ball right now to beat either of those teams. I would love to be wrong about that. We'll see what happens. But the postseason implications here are very obvious, and they're big for this team. I also just feel like, you know, Texas Tech's one of those schools. They're going to stay in the Big 12 with you. You're recruiting against them on a consistent basis. This has not been the season they expected. They had a lot of returning production and thought they'd be better than this. They're 3-5 at the moment. However, Joey McGuire has done a really good job recruiting, and it makes sense. I mean, part of it is he has extensive connections in the Texas high school football world. He was a longtime coach at Cedar Hill. He knows those coaches. He did a nice job at Baylor when he was assistant under Matt Rule and Dave Aranda, and then he parlayed that into the job at Texas Tech. And he's done a nice job recruiting. I mean, the crown jewel of this class, Micah Hudson, who they have committed, the 5-star wide receiver from Belton, who plays at Lake Belton High School. And they got, you know, they evaluated him early, really recruited him hard, and were able to get him to at least commit to the Red Raiders as signing day approaches here in a few months. And so that was a big deal. And they have what appears to be from the outside a pretty robust NIL budget, the Matador Club and big donors that are trying to funnel money specifically to the football and basketball programs. And so I think it's just important. You've won 4 in a row against Texas Tech. And they're, even with the rough season they're having, I think there's a lot of excitement and optimism around that program and the direction it's moving. Tech fans might disagree with me at the moment. I don't know. I haven't really had a chance to kind of take the pulse of how they're feeling about this season, if they think it's Joey's fault or if they just feel like it's, again, you know, a lot of injuries that have led to an underachieving year. But there's excitement and optimism around that program. And so you want to hold that advantage to at least go to players and say, hey, I know there's a lot of enticing things there, but bottom line is we've beaten them 5 years in a row. And that means something, I think, when you're talking to recruits, whether it's in the transfer portal or in the high school ranks, and you're trying to get them to come to school and play ball at TCU. Also, it's I think it's one of the coolest rivalry trophies in sports. The Battle for the Saddle is awesome. I know it's sort of underrated. And it's funny that it's technically like the Battle for West Texas, because I don't really feel like anybody considers Fort Worth West Texas anymore. But the rivalry trophy is awesome. And I'm glad that TCU's been able to, you know, keep that at home in Fort Worth the last few years, and you hope that can continue. But Thursday night in Lubbock, even with a rough season, I expect a big-time atmosphere. So what do we expect from Texas Tech? Because we spent all week really talking about this team, this TCU team, where they're at. They're having issues. What's the effort been like? What are some of the problems? Now you get another opponent. You get a chance to go win on the road, which would be significant. And honestly, like, this starts and ends for Texas Tech, in my opinion, with Taj Brooks. He has been their most consistent player, the running back, 891 yards on the season, about 5.5 yards per carry, 6 touchdowns. The senior from Manor, Texas, he has carried the load for this football team and done a really nice job running the football. And I think Tech's at their best when they're running the ball. They don't have a great offensive line from a pass protection standpoint, but they've been able to move people in the running game. Last week a couple weeks ago against BYU, they did lose that game 27-14, but he had 31 carries, 105 yards, and a touchdown. Against Kansas State, 17 carries for 98 yards and a touchdown. Went for 170 against Baylor, 149 against West Virginia, 158 against Tarleton. Averaged 8.5 yards per carry against Tarleton, 6 yards per carry against West Virginia. Actually averaged 10 yards a carry against Oregon, but only had 7 carries in the game. I can't remember if he got banged up or if they just sort of had to get away from the running game because they were behind in that football game. But Taj Brooks is the engine that makes this Tech offense go, already approaching almost 1,000 yards. And they have some good receivers. Miles Price comes back after having a big year last year. Xavier White is a big physical wideout who's got 317 yards receiving on the year. Price has 4 touchdowns. But overall, I think this offense is at its best when they're running the ball. Now, the good thing about it, or at least from an opponent's perspective, I guess, one thing to note is that Zach Keatley, the Tech offensive coordinator, who was widely regarded when he was hired, he was at Houston Baptist, and then I believe was at Western Kentucky, and then Tech hired him when Joey came over here. He will get pass happy at times, and so he'll kind of get away from that run game. Now, they did a nice job of running the football against BYU, or at least committing to it. They just couldn't score when they got in scoring territory and had some turnovers. And the quarterback situation, so Tyler Shuck went down in that West Virginia game with a broken leg. Baron Morton came in, and he started a few games, and he injured his shoulder against Kansas State. And so Jake Strong has been their quarterback for the last 2 weeks. But Joe McGuire said earlier this weekend that, or maybe it was late last week, that Morton has been practicing, that he's pretty much back to full strength. So I would expect Morton to start. His stat line so far this season, 68 completions on 119 attempts, 696 yards passing, 8 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He's done a pretty good job of protecting the football. Jake Strong, the true freshman who was coming into play, there was some arm talent there, but he threw 6 interceptions. You could just tell, learning the offense on the fly, he was having trouble protecting the football. Morton does a better job of that. I think he's been pretty solid when he's been in the football game. He came in against West Virginia, and his stat line was not very good in that ball game. But West Virginia has a good defense. Also, you're coming in the middle of a game. That's always a tough task. They lost that game 20-13, and he was 13-37 passing the football. But against Houston, he was 14-22 for 161 yards in that victory. Against Baylor, he was 19-26 for 180, and they won that game by a large margin. Now, I understand that Baylor and Houston are 2 of the worst teams in the Big 12, but, we're talking about a TCU team that's not exactly lighting it up. So Morton has shown some ability to be able to throw the football down the field, get the ball out quickly, make his reads, go through his progressions, and make plays. I think the key for TCU, and Joe Gillespie has not shown a lot of interest in doing this, at least as, the identity of his defense, but you need to bring pressure this week. Like, this Tech offensive line is where you can really make waves and make things happen. They're not great at pass blocking up front. And so you got to pressure the quarterback. You have to force them into throwing situations, stop the run, which is something they did a horrible job of last week, and try to get Morton out of the pocket and force him to make difficult throws against a secondary that I think can hold their own when there's a good pass rush and when the defense is functioning as it should. And so TCU is going to have to do that on Thursday night to come out and find a way to get a victory. This was a Tech team that played them really tough last season. Now, a big part of that was they had Tyree Wilson on defense, and he just wrecked shop against that TCU offense, especially in the first half of that ball game. And this Tech defense has been pretty solid for the most part. And so I know they're 3-5. I think there's some talent here, though. It kind of feels like TCU, and that there's a lot of reasons why you think Texas Tech should be successful, but it hasn't come together fully for them. A lot of that has to do with the quarterback situation and them not being healthy. But part of that goes back to the Tech O-line, which has really struggled to keep their quarterbacks upright. And so I think that's going to be a huge key to this football game. And can you get out to an early lead? Because you saw the difference between the BYU game and the Kansas State game with Josh Hoover and how comfortable he was playing with a lead, as opposed to getting behind early, especially on the road like that. And then things spiraled out of control and got out of hand really quickly. So significant game for TCU, not only from a postseason standpoint, but also just from, making a bowl game, continuing to build momentum in recruiting and keeping that advantage over Texas Tech they've had the last few years, because they continue to find ways to win this ball game. When we come back, some of you had thoughts about our discussion last week about, Kansas State, Scooper Beebe, who alleged that TCU quit in that ball game. We'll talk about that next. It's Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. First, I want to talk about Athletic Brewing Company. Athleticbrewing.com, Athletic Brewing Company, they have changed the game when it comes to the non-alcoholic beverage space. They have delicious non-alcoholic beer that tastes really good. It's full-flavored, well-crafted. They're great tasting and award-winning brews that beat out full-strength beers in global competitions, 50 styles of craft, including IPAs, golden sours, and more. And it's fit for all times. You can drink it whenever, whether you're working around the house, doing some things in the yard, hanging out watching TV, at your kids' soccer game, or whatever the case may be. You can feel comfortable enjoying Athletic Brewing Company and what they put together. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's beverages at stores near you, or you can buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers use the promo code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off. And again, that's Athletic Brewing Company, athleticbrewing.com is the website. Athleticbrewing.com, 15% off your first order if you use that promo code LOCKEDON. Athletic Brewing Company is sponsor here of the Locked On Network. So one reason I really like throwing things out to you guys, and whether it be you responding to me in the YouTube comments or on Twitter, is because I never know how people are going to react. Like, I had a lot of folks that were telling me late last week. So if you missed it on Friday's show, Cooper Beebe, who's an offensive lineman for Kansas State, he was discussing in a media session that game against TCU, and he alleged that TCU basically quit. He said, they looked up at one point, Frogs are losing about 30 points, and the defensive linemen are standing there and they're laughing and they're kind of joking around. And he said there's no better feeling in football than making someone quit, or feeling like you're able to just kind of break somebody's will and make them quit. And so obviously it set off a firestorm kind of online. TCU fans are frustrated. They want answers, and they're not happy, so they don't want the team to be content with what's going on. And so I talked about it, right? And I was like, listen, I would kind of write something like this off, but I think there might be some merit to it, because you look at this team, it doesn't feel like they're giving maximum effort week in and week out. It looks like a team that's really struggling to get up for games, that's not, going at it full speed, and it showed up in that football game on Saturday. But some of you disagreed with me, and I appreciate the feedback that you gave. A lot of you are also – my son Sawyer, he was dealing with RSV. We were in the hospital for a few days. We're back now, though. Thank you guys for praying. Many of you mentioned that. I really appreciate you lifting him up in prayer, and praise the Lord that he's back healthy and that he's doing well. Let's see. Michael Andrews said, if anyone was in a position to tell if a team quit or not, it would be the opposing team's offensive lineman. He feels like that comment is consistent with what we saw on the field and the final score. I mean, it's hard to argue with what happened on Saturday. Like, I don't think this team has necessarily mailed in the rest of the season and thrown in the towel for the whole year. But they got behind against K-State, and it didn't look like there was a lot of resistance after they got down early 14-0. And K-State's a good team. They went and bludgeoned Houston. I think they won that game 41-0 on Saturday. And they might go on and end up in Arlington. I mean, I thought after losing to Mizzou and Oklahoma State, I felt like the Wildcats were kind of done. But Oklahoma State has figured something out. Ollie Gordon's running the ball really well for them. Mike Gundy has that team playing well. And so now, like, that loss for them looks more like, okay, that was just a tough loss to a good team on the road, and not, you blew a tire in Stillwater and didn't come away with a victory, because they've just run the table since then. You took care of Tech. They figured out Avery Johnson could be someone who could play for them, and then just boat race TCU and Houston in back-to-back weeks. Jacob Langford said he thinks the story's been overplayed. He says, seems like all the TCU folks are running with this nonsense from some K-State offensive lineman to seeing our meetings and huddles, all because he saw someone laughing. He thinks that happens in every sport. And he went on to give an example of seeing Tiger Woods laugh when he's having a bad round. And he hopes the week off serves the team well and they come back in full force in Lubbock next week. I think how they respond is going to be huge. Like, if they come out and respond well against Texas Tech, then I feel like that'll answer some questions. It doesn't mean suddenly they're a great football team, but it at least means that they found a way to kind of get off the mat and dust themselves off and go win a tough environment on the road. And I think, Jacob, you could totally be right. Like, yeah, this is his perspective on it. And, to a certain extent, maybe it is human nature to look up at the scoreboard and you're like, man, we're getting beat tonight, and kind of laugh about it or whatever was said. I don't know what the context of it was, but it was a small snapshot of what's going on. It's obviously, though, a bad look when your team's struggling, when you have a coach in Sonny Dykes who has publicly and openly questioned the team's effort and mentality at times this year. And then, this happens, which sort of backs up a lot of the things that we've seen so far this season. Kevin Bell says human nature, especially for college kids, not acceptable, but late in the game when you're down huge and, you have no hope this could happen, especially on a team struggling for leadership. And maybe that was it. Maybe it was just a simple one-off, like, hey, it was a moment in time. It wasn't a big picture, game-changing picture of what the culture is on this football team. But obviously it set off a firestorm of talk about it. And, rightly so. It's pretty big to say that a team just kind of openly gave up. And it's, at the end of the day, it's kind of his word against the TCU team, which I haven't seen anybody really talk about it. And I don't expect them to get asked about it before the Texas Tech game. And Richard Berry said whether or not the team quit is debatable. You figure BYU quit the week prior if you're looking for that kind of headline. He just thinks the team's lack of leadership is the biggest weakness. Maybe they'll join the ranks of Texas A&M with good players and bad results if Sonny doesn't turn it around. And where is Sonny's influence on the offense? Yeah, all good questions. I think, first of all, to your point about lack of leadership, it's something that Sonny Dykes has talked about from a player's perspective. It just doesn't seem like it's there for this team this season, which is really unfortunate. And, you think about everything they did well last year in that space, the ability that those guys had to rally and get their teammates to be held accountable and play at a high level. That's just not there this season. And as far as Sonny's influence on the offense, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it's very hands-on with it, which I get why people are frustrated about that. But I think that's been his MO ever since his Cal stop, that he kind of lets his offense coordinator do his thing. And so I feel like the offense is obviously struggling. Some of that's execution. I think a lot of it also falls on Kendall Briles. And I don't know how Sonny's going to evaluate him at the end of this year. Obviously there's some extenuating circumstances that are going on. You lose your quarterback. You have an offensive line that I don't know how they evaluated that offensive line before the season. Publicly, they were saying positive things about the group, but they haven't been as good as I thought they could be. And so that's hamstrung a lot of things that you can do offensively. But overall, it's not working. And as the OC, like, even with the different limitations that your offense has, like, it's his job to figure out how to overcome that. And I think Sonny has to be part of that too. But it feels like Sonny has taken, more of all right, I'm going to be more of a CEO, allow coaches to do their jobs, and I'll be a sounding board. I'll be, someone who can jump in at times with suggestions, but I'm not going to be meddling in the business of the offense and defense every week. And maybe you should do that more, because it's not working. And he's an offensive mind. He's an offensive coach. That's his background. Maybe there's some things that he could bring to the table that would really help. But it doesn't appear like he's super involved right now. When we come back, we'll talk about some baseball and basketball notes. We'll go to some other sports in segment 3. It's Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. PrizePicks. If you are interested in wanting to play daily fantasy, if you're like, man, I've never done this before, PrizePicks is the place to go. PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. They have a really cool deal going on right now. I'll tell you in a minute about their deposit match. But it's really simple. You just go to the PrizePicks app, and it's as simple as like picking over-unders on different players and their stats. CeeDee Lamb had a big day yesterday. So if you going into Sunday, you're like, man, I think CeeDee's going to break out. Him and Mike McCarthy seem to be, kind of having some issues. CeeDee was expressing frustration. He's going to have a big breakout game. You could have bet over under 100 yards for CeeDee Lamb. If you went over, you would have hit on that bet. They have all kinds of special deals going on every week, like Taco Tuesday. Each Tuesday, PrizePicks discounts select player projections for up to 25% off to provide even more value. Do you think Odell Beckham's going to have a big week? Could he go over 50 yards? Will Josh Allen throw more than 2 passing touchdowns? We got a Monday night game tonight, but then going into next week, starting on Thursday, get ready with PrizePicks. PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. If you go to that website and use the promo code LockedOnCollege, you can get a first deposit match up to $100. So they'll match that first deposit up to $100. That's free money that you can play with. Again, that's PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. Promo code is LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks. If your fantasy team is struggling, like your all season fantasy team, you're like, I have some injuries. I don't know what's going on. I'm not going to be able to figure this out. Why don't you get on the daily fantasy at PrizePicks and start making money today? PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. And that promo code LockedOnCollege, they'll match your first deposit up to $100. So TCU Basketball had a secret scrimmages in quotes, because they're supposed to be like closed door scrimmages, but nowadays, like, this information tends to leak out and get out. And they supposedly won this game against Alabama, and they won it 85-81, 42 points in the first half, 43 points in the second half. Got a lot of minutes from a lot of different guys. And Emmanuel Miller had 14 points. He was 3-12 shooting, though. Jameer Nelson Jr., 25 points in the day. Trey Tennyson had 14. Jacoby Coles had 18. Ernest Uday only had 2 points on the day. I did see that he had a big dunk, though, and had a few blocks. A lot of guys coming off the bench. But overall, really nice effort by TCU Basketball. Now, I will say last year, they beat Alabama supposedly in a secret scrimmage like this, and I think won the game more handedly. And so it's not the end-all be-all, but it's encouraging that they played well against what's been a really good team in the Crimson Tide for the last few years. The thing that stood out to me, Mike Miles was so good for such a long time for this TCU team. And even if he wasn't scoring at a high clip every single game, just the way that he drew attention from the defense made everybody's job easier. And so I think that's going to be such a huge role that has to be filled now. And you're counting on Jameer Nelson Jr. to come over from Delaware as a transfer and do that. So the fact that he led the team in scoring and was really efficient and had a big day, that's really encouraging. I've also heard really good things about Micah Peavy this offseason. And, Micah's a guy that's been around for a while now. He hasn't been a great scorer, but he's been an outstanding defender, and he is someone that can finish around the rim. If his shot has more consistency, like if he becomes somebody that can be a knockdown shooter, even if it's just from the mid-range and not necessarily from three, even though if he can find a way to shoot from three, then we could be talking about Micah as an NBA guy one day, because he's so good at defending, on the perimeter, using his athleticism to give people fits. But if he can become a better shooter and more of an offensive threat, then the sky is really the limit for him, because his athleticism is great. Again, he does such a great job on the defensive side of the floor. And so I'd love to see him take a step up. He didn't play in the scrimmage, a little banged up with a hand injury, I believe, but he's working his way back. Uday is going to be the big guy in the middle. Hopefully he can give you huge minutes. Jacoby Coles became a much better scorer and a much better player as the year went on, and you'd love to see more from him. Emmanuel Miller, I'm not worried about him. I think, he's going to be consistent like he always has been. And then we'll see who else can step up and give them some quality minutes. Trace Innocent is supposedly a great shooter. They need more shooting, especially from the outside. Chuck O'Bannon, hopefully he can get more consistent hitting threes again this year. I think this is going to be a good basketball team, and I'm excited about what Jamie Dixon is trying to build and what he's trying to do with that program. On the baseball side, they're supposed to have a scrimmage at home, but it got canceled because of weather. They did beat Texas State last week in a fall scrimmage. Peyton Toll, who is the big two-way transfer, like he's going to hit in the middle of the lineup. He also pitched for Wichita State the last few seasons. I know he's been hitting it out. I've heard good things about Curtis Byrne. And one thing to remember about Curtis, like he was injured. He had a back injury, which, affected his ability to run and play catcher at the end of the season. But he was really solid as a DH last season. And so I think if he can hit the ball well, especially towards the end of the year, he was driving the ball all over the place. He's going to be a solid player in that lineup for them, whether he ends up catching or playing DH. Of course, you got Carson Bowen coming back, Anthony Silva coming back. Those guys are going to be great. Cole Klecker, I would imagine is going to be your Friday night starter, and he was fantastic last year. We'll see where Luis Rodriguez is coming back from injury. But a lot of things to be excited about on the baseball and basketball front. We'll cover that extensively as well. This is the Locked On Horned Frogs. We'll be back tomorrow. Tech Week, game on Thursday night, so we'll have plenty of coverage of that coming up. It's your team every day.